Welcome to the Gospel of Matthew. Looking forward to getting started with you on this course of study through the narrative, beginning to end, of the first Gospel of the New Testament. I want to use this video of orientation and introduction to the course to highlight three emphases of the course that will sort of be themes of our engagement with this text of Scripture, as well as our conversations with one another. They also probably reveal something of my approach to the course as your professor. And after I talk about these three emphases of the course, then I want to close with one bit of counsel, urging to you as you plan your participation in this course. So the first emphasis of this course that I want to emphasize is that it is designed to enable you to interpret the Gospel of Matthew as a narrative. As a narrative. Why is this important? Well, most of us have developed certain habits of reading and understanding of the Christian faith, interpretation of Scripture that treat the Bible generally, and Matthew in particular, as a kind of hodgepodge of fragmented truths or something like that. A kind of random collection of stories about Jesus. And that is not actually what Matthew is. Matthew is an elaborate, carefully crafted narrative that presents Jesus to us by virtue of the characteristics of this narrative that has a beginning and a middle and an end. There is dramatic development. There is the formation of characters and their relationships with one another. And this narrative development is actually key to how the story reveals Jesus to us, how it presents Jesus to us. And so throughout the course, I'm going to be trying to help us see not only sort of where we are in the arc of this story from beginning to middle to end, but also the way that the scenes of the narrative, if we can talk about them in that sense, the scenes of the narrative are related to one another in the way that they shape the story, the way that one story about Jesus in a particular place builds on what has come immediately before it, the way that it enables us to see something about Jesus that we wouldn't have seen if we had read it in isolation or not read the preceding scenes, and what this sort of contributes to the development of the presentation of Jesus as a whole. So reading the gospel as a narrative is going to be an abiding emphasis of the course that I hope will bring the gospel story out to you in a way to make it more colorful and engaging, and perhaps resist some of the cliches that have grown up around Jesus and maybe some of the particular stories in Matthew. I hope that you'll find that this deepens and enriches your understanding not just of Matthew, but of Jesus, who is the main subject of Matthew, of what it means to follow Jesus as a disciple, what it means to participate in his community that Matthew calls church. These sorts of matters depend on how the narrative develops, and therefore on our ability to read Matthew as a narrative. This gives way then to the second emphasis of the course as I will present it to you, and that is that the Gospel of Matthew, like the rest of the New Testament, but it's especially important for our interpretation of this story, the Gospel of Matthew is rooted in what we might call the biblical story of Israel. The whole story begins, of course, with these words: the book of the Genesis of Jesus Messiah, son of David, son of Abraham. It is a story that is already part of another story, a larger story, an ancient story that goes back to Abraham and even further back. And so the entire narrative of Matthew assumes a level of familiarity with this story, a sense of participating in it. And if we ignore the way that Matthew is rooted in that biblical Israelite context of the story of Israel, then there are all kinds of things about the narrative that we will completely miss. We will not be able to perceive their significance because we are reading Matthew as if it had nothing to do with that larger story of the people of Israel, of which it is an expression and which it claims to be the fulfillment of. So part of my job is to clarify for you how Matthew, how particular passages in Matthew, how the structure of the narrative is rooted in the biblical story of Israel. And this involves, of course, paying a great deal of attention to scriptures that we are apt to call Old Testament, even though there's nothing about them, for example, that is entirely past or over, according to Matthew. Matthew presents these scriptures to us as still very much alive, living and breathing, you might say, in the current moment of the generation that Matthew is telling the story of, and scriptures that will continue to live in relation to the presence of Jesus for generations to come, as they do for us now. So that is a second emphasis of this class, is the biblical Israelite context of the narrative of Matthew, the story of Israel, you might say. And you're going to find that in one of your assignments, including a response form in the first week, there's a great deal of reading in the Old Testament that is designed to sort of bring to the fore some of the main themes of the drama of Israel's life that are key to understanding Matthew's presentation of Jesus to us. Third emphasis of the course is going to be what I would call the theological, ethical nature of the text of Matthew. Many of you might come to this class thinking that Matthew is a book that, because it comes from a long time ago, in a cultural context, say, very different from our own, that in order to read it well, we first have to sort of suspend all theological and ethical commitments and interpret the story as a kind of historical artifact, as something that is locked in the past and comes to us sort of like a piece of a museum that we have to unearth in order to perceive its significance. I want to challenge that assumption and that sort of approach to biblical interpretation generally, and suggest that already as we are studying Matthew, the text is a theological and ethical matter. The way that it has been conveyed to us across time by a very diverse and messy community of people, so that community of people has shaped our imagination for what these words might say. God has been involved in that process and is involved in the process of interpretation, so that we can't sort of turn theology off or turn ethics off as we study Matthew, knowing that it comes to us from a place long ago. This means that we're not going to sort of practice the interpretation of Matthew in that familiar pattern of two moments. First, sort of the historical context or cultural context moment, and then we turn to pastoral meaning or application, theological significance, or its ethical call upon our life, something like that. I'm going to present Matthew The text as we read it has already charged with theological and ethical power. That doesn't mean that its theological and ethical meaning is immediately apparent, that it doesn't require work, that we might not want to ask certain historical or cultural questions. But as we do, we're already engaged, I want to suggest, in a sort of theological task. And we're reading a story that already bristles with ethical power. It is calling to us as we are making sense of it. It is judging us. And as Matthew teaches us, it is saving us in the very way that it judges our patterns of speech, imagination, and life, all of which can be exposed to a greater or lesser degree in the way that we are engaging the story. So that's going to be the third emphasis of this class that I regard as a key sort of responsibility of mine as the professor of the class, is to help clarify the theological, ethical power of this story from the beginning, not as a secondary moment that comes after historical context or cultural context or something like that, but as something that is already implicit even when we are asking historical and cultural sorts of questions. Hopefully you'll see that presented less as a kind of, philosophical or hermeneutical matter, and more just as the way that we go about interpreting the text of Matthew, what our discussions are getting at as we attempt to perceive together its call upon our life. So this is not so much a big methodological concern of mine. It's more, I think, a concern that I bring to our class that a graduate seminary sort of education not keep us from engaging. That this is a text that we relate to as Christians, that it is calling to us as we study it. And all of our academic energy and tools should not estrange us from the Christian nature of this text or its call upon us, but actually enable us to engage that call with more rigor and more care. So that's the third emphasis. Finally, just in the last couple minutes here, I just want to urge you, especially those of you who have perhaps not taken as many online courses, that this course requires that you maintain something of a steady rhythm. Sometimes in-person classes, you can sort of get away with tending to other things in your life or other classes for a few weeks because you don't have a big paper due or whatever, and then you can reconnect to the class later. That won't work with this. There's no way really to make up most of the work that we do together each week, because it depends on the discussions that we're having together and which texts that we have before us that are the subject of our conversations. And so I'm just wanting to encourage you here at the beginning of the course to do whatever planning you need to do to structure your week so that you're able to give a rhythm of time to this course, as opposed to sort of trying to rush through everything the last few hours before it's supposed to be up on Canvas or something like that. You're going to get a lot more out of this course and contribute a lot more to the rest of us who are taking it if you find a more regular rhythm in which to digest the course material and then to contribute your own thoughts to our discussions. So that is what I have for you in this introductory video. I hope that you'll find this first week to get us off on a good start. I think you'll find that this first week asks that you do quite a bit of reading and to think very broadly about Matthew, about the story of Israel. And I hope that that kind of wide-ranging conversation will furnish the sort of framework and context that we need for productive engagement with the text and with one another for the rest of the course. So looking forward to seeing you in the forums.